Hey there, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to look at the very famous Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, first things first, let's talk about the context of this speech. This was a speech that was given by President Abraham Lincoln on November 19, 1863, at the dedication of a cemetery at the site of the Battle of Gettysburg. You know, for those of you who don't remember, and hey, no judgment, the Battle of Gettysburg was like the turning point of the Civil War. Like after this battle, the momentum of the war turned definitively in favor of the Union, and the Confederates never really got past this northern territory again. Now, when Lincoln came to dedicate this cemetery at the site of the battle, he was invited to give some remarks, and he took that invitation. However, he only had a few minutes to speak, because the star attraction of this event was actually the famous Civil War general, General George Meade. And so Lincoln was kind of like the opening act for him. And because of that, Lincoln just kind of prepared a couple brief sentences to say. But then when he arrived at the site and saw the crowds gathered and realized how monumental the occasion really was, he decided to take more time with it. He revised his remarks and wound up delivering the most important and most famous speech of his career. And yes, it's true that Abraham Lincoln had already delivered the very famous Emancipation Proclamation before this, but I would argue that the Gettysburg Address is even more significant than that document. Why? Well, for one thing, it was a speech that was meant to be heard. So Lincoln was able to use rhetorical devices in the speech that he couldn't necessarily use in that proclamation. And secondly, I would argue that the Gettysburg Address even furthered the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was to abolish slavery. How so? Well, Lincoln in this speech argues that the nation was built on the principle of equality, and that the Civil War was about preserving that union, and thus preserving the notion that all men are created equal. And of course, slavery was antithetical to that idea. So by preserving the Union in this speech, Lincoln was also arguing for the necessity of abolishing slavery. Okay, now let's talk about the structure of this speech and some of its most famous parts. First off, let's start with the beginning. With those famous words, 7 years ago, Lincoln established a tone of solemnity and historical weight for his address. That phrase, 7, is an old-timey way of saying 87. And with that phrase, Lincoln immediately links the founding of the nation with the present crisis, showing that the current struggle is nothing new, but part of an ongoing story. In this first paragraph, Lincoln also establishes the ideals on which the nation was founded. The nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And right away, that second phrase is loaded with significance. By invoking natural rights philosophy, especially as developed by John Locke, Lincoln essentially argues that the government derives its just powers from the governed. In other words, the people are the ultimate source of political power, and government must be organized to protect their natural rights. And of course, in the context of the Civil War, this meant that the Southern states had no right to leave the Union, because such an action would trample the rights of the people who lived there. In the second paragraph, Lincoln makes it clear that the Civil War is a test of whether a nation founded on those ideals can actually survive. In other words, the war is a test of whether a government of, by, and for the people can endure. Then in the third paragraph, Lincoln makes it clear why he and the Union soldiers are gathered at this particular place. They have come to dedicate a portion of the battlefield as a cemetery for those who died there. And he addresses the crowd directly and says that it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. However, he then goes on to say that in a larger sense, they really can't dedicate, consecrate, or hallow this ground. Why not? Because the soldiers who fought and died there have already done that. Their bravery has made the ground sacred, and Lincoln argues that he and the rest of the assembled people really can't add to that or take away from it. Instead, it is for the living to be dedicated to the unfinished work of the fallen. And so now we come to that famous line. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Let me pause here for a second and talk about the power of this speech. What's so amazing about it is how much Lincoln is able to accomplish in so few words. He's put a moral imperative upon the Civil War. Now it's not enough to simply win battles. There must be a moral purpose behind the sacrifice of life on the battlefield, and that moral purpose is the preservation of the Union and, by extension, the preservation of human equality. He's consecrated a battlefield without actually using any overtly religious language. And he's invoked a distinctly American voice that could only belong to a free people, even if, at that moment in history, they were struggling to define what that freedom actually looked like. In the last paragraph, Lincoln calls upon the living to take an increased devotion to the cause of the fallen. And he famously resolves that the dead shall not have died in vain. Again, Lincoln is putting a moral imperative upon the war effort. To die for a cause is one thing, but to die for a cause that doesn't advance human freedom would be tragic. And so the living must ensure that the cause of the fallen is advanced. Lincoln then launches into a vision of a new birth of freedom for the nation. Now, some people interpret this phrase to mean that Lincoln is talking about a rebirth of the nation as a truly free and equal place. Others interpret this to mean that Lincoln was using that language figuratively to refer to the need for the nation to be reborn in its commitment to liberty and equality. And finally, Lincoln ends with the famous assertion that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And by repeating that last phrase, he hammers home the purpose of the speech. This is what the nation was founded on, and this is what the soldiers died to preserve. Okay, that's the speech. Do you see how brilliant it is? Like I mentioned earlier, this speech is studied throughout the world for its historical, political, and cultural significance. For literary purposes, it's a striking study of literary power founded in the economy of words. No wasted words. Every word counts. And because of that, this speech is still as relevant today as it was 175 years ago. And hey, if you want me to keep making these videos, express your freedom by clicking that subscribe button and I shall oblige. I'm out.